A winter battlefield is not simply cold terrain. It is a metabolic trap. When temperatures fall below freezing and movement slows, the human body begins a quiet rationing process. Blood is redirected inward. Extremities are deprioritized. Toes become negotiable. Frostbite does not begin with dramatic pain. It begins with damp fabric, restricted circulation, and the slow theft of heat through evaporation. German invasion of the Soviet Union. The prevailing assumption was straightforward: thicker socks, heavier leather, tighter lacing. Insulate more. Protect more. Yet the medical evidence from multiple fronts revealed something unsettling. The very methods soldiers relied on to stay warm were accelerating heat loss from the inside out. Buried in quartermaster reports and cold weather research conducted between 1942 and 1945 is a deceptively simple solution: a vapor barrier layering technique that, when applied correctly, halted early-stage frostbite almost immediately by stopping evaporative heat loss inside the boot. It was built from basic materials, sometimes rubberized fabric, sometimes waxed paper, sometimes improvised liners, and grounded in raw physics rather than advanced technology. At the outset of the war, no major army fully grasped the scale of cold injury that mechanized warfare would produce. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 exposed this gap brutally. During the first winter of Operation Barbarossa, frostbite cases in the Wehrmacht reached staggering numbers. The standard-issue leather marching boot, effective in Western Europe, became rigid and heat-conductive in sub-zero Russian temperatures. The Red Army relied heavily on felt Valenki boots, which provided better insulation but were vulnerable to moisture and thaw conditions. Both sides suffered enormous non-combat attrition. The common factor was not simply low temperature. It was moisture accumulation. Leather absorbs sweat. Wool holds it. Once saturated, both become efficient conductors of heat away from the skin. Add restricted circulation from tightly laced boots, and the stage is set for tissue freezing. Medical officers began noticing a pattern. Soldiers with wet socks and compressed feet developed frostbite at far higher rates than those who kept boots slightly loose and rotated socks frequently. The problem was not insufficient insulation. It was internal climate failure. Evaporation, not exposure, was stripping heat from soldiers' feet. The human foot can produce significant moisture during sustained marching, even in freezing conditions. In temperate weather, evaporation carries that moisture away. In extreme cold, evaporation becomes a heat thief trapped inside insulation layers. When sweat evaporates, it absorbs energy from its surroundings. That energy comes from the skin. In a confined boot, moisture migrates outward into socks and leather, where it cools and eventually freezes. Each phase change extracts more heat. The result is a microclimate of damp cold pressed directly against tissue. Early war solutions focused on thicker wool socks. This often made conditions worse. Thick socks reduced the air gap inside the boot and compressed blood vessels. Circulation decreased. The foot became colder even before freezing began. By 1943, American and Canadian cold weather research units were experimenting with a counterintuitive approach: stop evaporation entirely. The vapor barrier concept changed everything. The vapor barrier method was grounded in a simple premise. If moisture could not migrate outward into insulation, the insulation would remain dry. If insulation remained dry, it would retain trapped air. And trapped air is the true insulator. In practice, this meant placing a non-breathable layer between the foot and the insulating sock. In some cases, this was a purpose-built rubberized liner. In others, soldiers improvised with waxed paper, treated fabric, or thin rubber sheeting. A thin inner sock absorbed minimal moisture against the skin. Over that, a waterproof barrier prevented sweat from reaching the outer insulating layer. Outside the barrier, wool socks and the boot itself stayed dry. The sensation was unfamiliar. Feet felt damp, but they remained warm. Medical evaluations showed that when properly fitted boots allowed room for circulation and when vapor barriers were used consistently, frostbite rates dropped sharply. Early numbness often reversed once evaporative heat loss stopped. The freezing process was interrupted not by adding insulation, but by halting internal moisture transfer. This was not theoretical science. It was field adaptation under combat pressure. The Ardennes offensive revealed the cost of ignoring moisture physics. In December of 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, American forces were thrown into one of the coldest European winters in decades. Supply chains were strained. Many units lacked adequate overshoes or vapor barrier boots. Frostbite cases surged into the thousands within weeks. Post-action reports from the United States Army Medical Department noted a consistent trend. Units that enforced sock changes, foot inspections, looser lacing, and vapor barrier use experienced significantly fewer severe frostbite injuries than units that relied solely on heavier socks. The lesson was clear. Insulation without moisture control was insufficient. After the war, these findings shaped the development of insulated rubber Mickey Mouse boots used in Korea and later Arctic deployments. These boots integrated a sealed airspace and vapor barrier into a single system. They were bulky, but highly effective. Their design lineage can be traced directly to wartime experimentation with moisture containment. Why breathable fabrics can fail in extreme cold. Modern outdoor marketing often emphasizes breathability. In moderate cold and high-activity scenarios, breathable membranes help regulate sweat. But in sustained, deep cold where evaporation leads directly to freezing, breathability can become counterproductive. If moisture passes into insulation and freezes, insulation loses loft, and conductive heat loss increases. The World War II vapor barrier insight recognized that in certain temperature ranges, preventing moisture migration entirely is safer than encouraging it. This principle remains embedded in contemporary cold weather doctrine for Arctic operations. It is not universally comfortable. It requires careful sock rotation and hygiene management. But the physics remain unchanged since 1944. The forgotten hack was discipline, not equipment. The effectiveness of the vapor barrier technique depended on more than materials. Boots had to be sized correctly to allow airspace. Laces had to remain loose enough to preserve circulation. Socks needed rotation and drying whenever possible. Leaders had to enforce foot inspections. Frostbite prevention became a command responsibility. Where officers treated it seriously, casualties declined. Where it was dismissed as minor discomfort, men paid with permanent injury. The broader lesson is not about a specific boot insert. It is about understanding how small physiological miscalculations compound under stress. The body can generate heat. It cannot tolerate sustained evaporative loss in sub-zero confinement. What this reveals about winter survival beyond the battlefield. The vapor barrier system developed during the Second World War dismantled a common myth. Warmth does not come from piling on endless breathable layers. Warmth comes from managing moisture, preserving circulation, and protecting insulation from internal saturation. Cold injuries develop quietly. Numbness often precedes damage. The moment evaporation is controlled and blood flow restored, progression can stop. That is why soldiers reported near immediate improvement when switching to vapor barrier configurations in extreme cold. The internal heat loss mechanism was shut down. This insight extends beyond military history. It applies to mountaineering, Arctic exploration, and even prolonged winter power outages where heating systems fail. The physics of moisture and insulation do not change with context. Remembering the overlooked details of war matters. Large-scale histories of the Second World War focus on strategy and geopolitics. Yet the durability of armies depended on small adaptations like this one. The battle against frostbite was not dramatic, but it preserved divisions that might otherwise have collapsed under environmental strain. The lost boot hack was not glamorous. It was practical. It emerged from observation, data, and necessity. and it reshaped cold weather doctrine for decades to come. Understanding these lesser-known innovations reminds us that survival in war often hinges on physics as much as firepower. When we examine the overlooked, we gain a fuller picture of what endurance required. If you value this kind of detailed historical analysis, subscribe to Hidden in History. Share this video with others who believe that the smallest lessons from the past often carry the greatest weight.